Good afternoon. Welcome to my little cozy book corner. Um, Thanks for spending the semester with me. We're going to end this week. I just wanted to kind of talk about something we haven't talked about yet, and that is whether games are art or not, and what type of stories a game invites you into. Now, some games don't really have a story driven um, mode of play. I'm thinking of some of your kind of classic, almost childhood board games like Asari or Aggravation or something like that. It doesn't really invite you into a story. It just says, hey, you're in competition to get from your base, get from where you start to where you end. Um, doesn't really tell you who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing it, anything like that. Um, I mean, something like a hi ho cheerio actually kind of you're picking cherries, blah blah blah. Um, but you have this story element as you get more advanced into games. Um, some games like a Monopoly, you can kind of just ignore the storyline of being this person who's a kind of unchecked capitalist who's trying to get everything, um, become that person with the monopoly and just try to beat each other. Um, but there is a little bit of a story there with Uncle Penny, whatever, Uncle Pennywise. Um, Shoots and ladders, a little bit of a story. Um, but as you get more and more advanced, you have games like kind of the breakthrough game most people play to get into what's called Euro games, European games, more strategy based, less chance based games like a Settlers of Catan. It's right there. You're settling this island. You're trying to settle it better, more, faster than the people that you are playing against who are also trying to settle the island. And then you can get into games that have very complex storytelling. There's been a move in a lot of games to like legacy mode, which is kind of this you play over and over again, different kind of scenarios where you're trying to move up. You have like the pandemic legacy. You have games like betrayal at the haunted house where you're trying to understand this haunted house you're invited into with certain games, kind of the Cthulhu mythos. Um, you have games where you have board games where you move and the story moves you. You're trying to enter into this. You're trying to do this. A game like Munchkin, which is very popular, um, is a classic like dungeon crawl. We are moving from the first dungeon to the last dungeon, collecting items, kitting out your character, adding races and classes to them, and then fighting against each other, trying to get to the end. Very stripped down, lighter version of a classic role playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, which right is very story based. Right, the original Dungeons and Dragons was the dungeon master, the person in control, kind of told the story. You interacted with it a little bit. It was a little bit like if you remember those old choose your own adventure books where the dungeon master would say, hey, you're here, what do you want to do, turn left, turn right, right, and he or she would move the story along based on your choices and some obfuscated dice rolls. And now with like fifth edition or Pathfinder, you have much more player control, player interaction, who does what, but you still have this dungeon master who tells you this story, brings you into these plots. You try to inhabit these characters if you're good at the role playing aspects. You have various intellectual properties that get into this, inviting you into the Wars world, Lord of the Rings, Dresden Files, etc., where you have someone telling you the story, or like a lot of the role-playing games, tabletop based, they have already pre-written, prefabricated stories that kind of you can read through and play through um, without even having a dedicated storyteller, without having someone try to come up with their own story. Because we've been focusing a lot on this semester, this idea of how do we interact with stories around us? How do the stories shape us? And we can see this if we play board games, that sometimes they don't. There is no story really there. They don't really shape us. But when you get deeper and deeper into games, you get into questions of like ethics and responsibility towards others. How do we interact with the world? How do we see ourselves in the world? And sometimes in these games, you can play as another kind of, I don't know, characteristic of your personality that usually you kind of set aside, or you can take on a completely different personality and kind of try that out through the game. So you have these various modes of understanding gameplay and understanding story, and depending on who's telling the story, you can get rich, deep, meaningful stories being told, or you can just have a story that's light and fun and lets you kind of traverse an imaginary world for a set amount of time each week or month, or if you're like a typical Dungeons and Dragons player, whatever, you can get, adults together to play. Um, so we kind of have that in your board game. Some of the like deck builders, like Dominion, you don't really need to do. Sometimes you don't even know the story behind it. You just know you're collecting cards and you're trying to um, get the right amount of victory points in the end. But there is a story, there is a mythos behind it that's being told. There is a plot, a reason why you're doing it. So with games, you can see, especially just starting with board games, you can see this, like, you choose how much you want to get involved into the story. Same thing with video games. There are some video games that you might not know the story of, but there is backstory there. A game like Tetris, you might not have ever thought about why or what you're doing there. But something like a Dr. Mario takes that and adds a different level of story onto it, um, by changing the blocks to pills and color matching and trying to rescue. Speaking of Mario, we have, right, all the Marios, you're basically, until probably the last couple, right, save the princess, but you're trying to save the world, and there's this deep, rich story that goes on behind the scenes. Like in Mario, all of the Goombas that you jump upon are actually villagers who have been transformed by King Koopa, and it's this weird morose thing that you're jumping on them and killing them instead of transforming them back into the villagers that they once were, and you wonder why an Italian plumber, but right. So sometimes the story falls apart, but there is story there. And you see, as these game series kind of develop, you see more and more, a lot of times, of a richer story being put out there. You have, with the advent of the first person shooter games, you have like your Wolfensteins, where you're going out and killing Nazis. You have same with Rise of the Triad and a few others that kind of stem off from that. You have Doom, where you're sent into hell and you're trying to kill everything in hell. At the same time, you can just play them as just shooting things, having fun, getting ridiculous weapons, etc., etc. With Grand Theft Auto, you have a move through a world where you're doing story-based. You're trying to complete these missions, which develop kind of this richer feeling, this richer texture to this world, where you could also interact with it. Like one of my friends, when Vice City first came out, all they wanted to do was see how far they could jump, see how many cops they could avoid, and didn't interact with the story at all. So there's a lot of, when you get into kind of the video game role-playing games, you get this rich story that they're trying to tell you. There's somewhat of a story in all of like the Final Fantasy games that connect together in a world. You have something like oh crud, it just anyways, some games you have no idea kind of what the story is, but you're trying to think about it and piece together things, and the longer you piece together things, it's harder to figure out. Like I was trying to think of Kingdom Hearts, the kind of Disney-ish game, but things are changed. Like they wouldn't let Mickey Mouse kill people with a sword, so you've got a giant key, which somehow makes sense in their world, right? But you could kind of ignore those deep layers if you want. You could just go through the world that is there. Also, inside of that, you have games that have rich textures to them. They have time put into the kind of scenery, the art behind them. With board games, you have more and more elaborate art on the cards, on the pieces. And you also have stuff that's super minimal, plain, doesn't really add to that sense. You don't really look at it as an art piece, where some cards are, in some card games, are like critically acclaimed for the way that they present themselves artistically. And like that can draw you in. It can give you a beautiful experience by looking at the art when you play. But again, all of that can be ignored. So I'm kind of wondering, how do you interact with games as art? Do you see games as art and as story? Do you just want to get a couple of friends together and play something like Uno and not worry about what a story is or how this kind of shapes our world, and you just want to see how many times you can get someone to draw four, especially if you're playing the variant where you stack, draw twos and draws fours, which is not the right way to play, but much more fun, right? Are you trying to get together with people and play something like a Code Names, which is kind of advanced memory, with a little bit of like almost a little bit of a twist on it? Or are you trying to like do something like your Words Against Humanities or whatever, Cards Against Humanity, where you're trying to let that outlet valve of kind of that personality kind of being a little bit more cruel, a little bit more crass come out with your friends? And what does that tell you about your friend? I mean, you could learn a lot by the cards people play and Cards Against Humanity and how much they want to play it. But how much does story matter? Does the game tell you about the story, about your life? And do you choose to interact with games as story or not?